This is the ETB playmat. Conventional playmats are just giant mouse pads. You have to roll them up, they're hard to store. If you have a tube, often it doesn't fit in your backpack. The ETB playmat changes that. They're rigid internal panels, so it's easy to fold flat. They're secure magnets that keep everything shut, and it also fits in a 15-inch laptop sleeve.
Welcome back, Magic players, to the Dreamhack Denver Regional Championship. I am Niall Joan Rivers. In the booth with me today is Mason Clark. Mason, how you doing?
I'm so excited. We have a win-and-in situation going on here at the RC. It is time to figure out who's going to be in our top 8 and playing for that Worlds invite, along with locking up their Pro Tour invite.
That's right. High stakes Magic today. And the first round, it looks like we're going to be bringing to you is Gabriel Nicholas on Izzet Murktide versus Jody Keith on Mono White Martyr. Now, Mason, we saw Jody yesterday on Mono White Martyr. We've seen this list. What are your thoughts on it getting this far?
Yeah, so Mono White Martyr looks to really just be a control deck, right? This is something that's trying to use the One Ring to its fullest capability by offsetting the life loss that happens from the One Ring, and then tries to just prolong the game to get to the point where a Mirror of the Sky Ruin can accrue enough value along with the One Ring to put the opponent in the dirt. It has a couple cool locks available to it. And at the end of the day, Jody is really just playing mono white control. That is the best way to look at this. And traditionally, those kind of decks are really good against what our opponent is playing in Murktide.
Right. So Gabriel Nicholas, this is their Murktide list. Pretty classic modern deck. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think that there are some things that Gabriel's going to be able to do that are going to be really powerful. Like if we can set up an early Murktide Regent plus Counterspell, that's going to be really good against Jody, and we might be able to, take Jody out before he can sort of assemble his lock like we saw in our couple feature matches yesterday. But outside of that, we aren't really prepared for this deck, which is one of the big strengths of Jody's deck. It isn't playing a ton of tools that people are used to fighting over. And so while we have some cards that might incidentally hit Jody's deck, we're not really coming prepared for it. And some of our cards don't line up super well into his cards.
All right, well, let's delay no further. We are ready, I believe, to get straight into this match. Here we have Jody Keith on the left and Gabriel Nichols on the right, ready to watch these two players for their win-and-ins for top 8, correct?
Yep. And Gabriel is someone who plays a lot of Magic Online and plays Murktide a lot. So this is not Gabriel just being like, oh, Murktide's like, maybe okay this weekend. Gabriel is a Murktide player. And so it is possible that, Jody plays this deck a lot of Magic Online. Maybe they actually have played, now that I'm thinking about it, because this is a deck that Jody Keith has put up a lot of solid top 16 finishes in the Magic Online challenges.
Right, and getting straight into the game, it's going to be Gabriel Nichols on the play with a Ragavan turn 1, and Jody's turn, he's going to get down a Martyr immediately.
Yeah, we saw yesterday how good Martyr was at gaining life, but also here just being able to block Ragavan actually forces, an unholy heat from Gabriel there.
Right, which is going to clear the way for this Ragavan, which is just going to hit a Plains off the top of Jody's deck, but will still make a treasure for Gabriel. He's going to go ahead and play a Ledger Shredder, and that looks like that's going to be it.
Yeah, and this is a really good start from Gabriel. We need to get on the board quickly. We need to make sure that Jody isn't able to, prevent us from, stopping aggression, and we just need to try to get pressure on Jody before he can set up his engine cards that really matter.
Right, a second Martyr for Jody as Gabriel swings in on his turn, and the Martyr is going to go ahead and block that Ragavan. Now, we did see a temporary lockdown in Jody's hand, so he's definitely got answers for these two smaller creatures. And it looks like he is going to be activating the Martyr and revealing 4 white cards.
Yeah, those 2 Skyclave apparitions are also something that can be kind of frustrating. Now, we do see temporary lockdown there, and that will sort of answer all of Gabriel's threats at the moment. But the Skyclave apparitions make it so later on, we're able to maybe knock out like a future Ledger Shredder or something. Notably here, though, nothing that really lines up well against Murktide Regent. Before the game started, we talked about how we probably want to try and set up an early Murktide plus Counterspell to kind of go the distance. And Gabriel's kind of doing that a little bit here. Has the Murktide in hand with Spell Pierce, not quite Counterspell, but something to look at for sure.
Yeah, and he did get a bauble off of the Expressive Iteration, which will work as the second spell for turn. He is resolving the Connive trigger now and taking a look at the top of Jody's deck with the bauble. And he's going to play Island and pass, take his draw step on Jody's upkeep.
I really like this from Gabriel, by the way. One thing that I often bring up about Expressive Iteration is that it's kind of like Brainstorm from Legacy, where a lot of the times you want to hold it for as long as you possibly can to cast it. That way you can get the most advantage from the card and kind of sculpt your hand correctly. Gabriel here knows he's trying to set up an early Murktide plus counterspell, and that he has a Spell Pierce to stop this lockdown from Jody. So if Jody does something like slam plane, slam lockdown, Gabriel can punish with the Spell Pierce and maybe set up that Murktide on the next turn plus counterspell, which would be a very hard board for Jody to actually answer.
Right, and it looks like the two non-revealed cards in Jody's hand, we have a land, which he's playing and fetching right now, and I believe that was a Solitude in hand as well.
Yeah, and this is one of the things we talked about Jody's deck, right? It is just a control deck, just not a traditional control deck. And so cards like Solitude are one of the few things he has that easily clean up a Murktide Regent, and that is something that Gabriel needs to be aware of.
Right, and he is going to go ahead and fetch out of Plains and slam down the lockdown, but Gabriel has the answer for it in the Spell Pierce. That is going to be the end of Jody's turn, giving Gabriel quite the setup with his Ledger Shredder and Ragavan swinging in immediately.
Yep.
There's going to be a One Ring off the top of Jody's deck. This is huge. What do you think the chances are Gabriel wants to play that this turn?
I was going to mention how Gabriel's actually kind of flooding out a lot, hitting a lot of lands here. You know, Murktide doesn't play a ton of lands. Gabriel just rocking 18 this weekend. But this One Ring might be the way for him to actually make use of all this mana, because we don't really have any more protection spells. It looks like we just have lands and Murktide in hand. And if that's the case, the One Ring might be something that actually can absorb that Skyclave Apparition's ETB and allow us to keep the pressure up. We're only hitting for 3 right now, which isn't a much, with Jody still being at 26 somehow, despite getting hit by this Ragavan every turn. But it is a start, and we have to keep the pressure going. If we slow down too much, Jody will have too much time. So I could see Gabriel wanting to do something like that. Looks like we're maybe checking for Delirium, checking to see if we want to get a Murktide going. I could see it going either way here, because Murktide is a really hard to answer threat, and he knows that the shield is down on Reprieve.
All right, and it looks like we are counting out 5 cards from the graveyard. That is going to be a Murktide, coming in with 3 +1/+1 counters. Passing to Jody, not going to play the ring today.
Yeah, it does make some amount of sense too, just because Jody might not fight over the One Ring, and maybe you can't kill Jody before the ring actually kills you. One thing that happens a lot with ring control decks is that they have to have a second ring at some point to stop the life loss. And as we know, Gabriel didn't actually put any One Rings in his own deck, so he might be worried about just the lack of pressure in hand. If he takes the time to put something like the One Ring, Reprieve might stop the Murktide long term, and then we're going to be in big trouble.
All right, an Apparition going to come down for Jody, targeting the Ragavan. Just going to go ahead and deal with that problem. And Gabriel is going to bolt it at end of turn. It looks like Jody is taking a second here to contemplate.
Yeah. If Gabriel wasn't, we know that Jody has the Solitude. If Gabriel wasn't thinking about the card Solitude, probably is now, because that is really the only thing in Jody's deck list that would have him thinking right here. Jody Keith is, someone who's played a lot of competitive Magic. I'm sure Gabriel knows this. And, it's open deck list, so everyone knows what they have going.
All right, he is going to evoke the Solitude. That will be second spell for turn, triggering the Connive on the Ledger Shredder, which is going to get a counter on it.
Yeah, we picked up the counterspell off the Connive. We can counterspelled the Solitude. That's what we hit there. That's why we discarded the Expressive Iteration. And now Gabriel has Jody in an unenviable position. Jody has to draw something like Wrath of God with the One Ring immediately.
Right, and despite all the life that Jody managed to gain in the early game, he is now down on life to Gabriel, 16-19, with not a whole lot of answers. I think this is looking pretty good for Gabriel here. But, a control deck like Jody's, there have to be some cards in there that can get him out of this, right?
Yeah, the One Ring can buy us a whole turn, draw us like 3 cards pretty easily. Jody plays actual Wrath of God in his deck, the OG. So that is a card that could be very powerful here if we're able to find it. There's a couple other spot removal spells. We have like Winds of Abandon, which if we draw one more land, we could get Overload to hit all the creatures. But, they're going to need to get drawn relatively soon.
Right, and Jody's going to go ahead and play the Apparition, targeting the Ledger Shredder. We're going to go back over to Gabriel, taking a look at his graveyard. He does have the DRC on board, and he's just going to swing out.
Yeah, it's a little hard to tell, but it does look like the DRC does have flying. Does not have flying, excuse me. So
Sure, so Jody just going to take some damage, go down to 10 life, it looks like. And we're going to go back over to Jody's turn. Not sure what he has drawn for turn. Maybe we'll get a peek here in a moment.
I like that attack from Gabriel. It can be really tempting to not want to throw away your DRC, but he's now set it up to where if he draws Bolt, he'll win.
Right, and Jody went ahead and scooped, getting our first win to Gabriel very quick, considering, this is a control deck. We watched it yesterday. We watched it have some pretty long games against the opponent we saw Jody against. What do you think about how that game turned out, Mason?
I think that what we talked about before of like, if the game goes super long, it's probably going to fade or Jody is something that we didn't allow to happen. And we tried to set up that quick clock early and then have a counterspell for the high impact turn. And that's ended up ultimately what happened in that game. Jody went to try and get the Solitude while it seemed like shields were down. And, we just had the counterspell, which made us able to actually, stop the Solitude and push a bunch of damage. That is what Gabriel needs if we're going to win this matchup. We need a clock plus disruption. If you just have disruption, Jody can beat it. If you just have a clock, Jody can beat it. We need that combination of the two. And I think the players are ready for game number 2.
All right, well, let's see if in game 2, Gabriel's able to get that clock and disruption, the perfect balance. Once again, this time we are going to see Jody on the play. We're looking at our players' opening hands here now. Seeing, it looks like they are both keeping 7, and Jody is starting us off with a Surveil land. And, well, we got a little bit of the clock on board with a turn 1 DRC for Gabriel.
Like we talked about before, Gabriel plays a lot of Magic online. A lot of you might know him as Oink Mage there, and plays this deck a lot. So, Gabriel, I think more than most, is probably ready for a weirder sort of unorthodox approach that Jody is bringing here. Because, let's call it a spade. Mono White Martyr is not, a deck you see a ton of currently in Modern. After this weekend, that might be changing. But, Gabriel seems really prepared to play, and I've been really impressed so far at how quickly and decisively he's been making his choices. I think someone who really kind of knows what his deck's trying to do, and in the deck review portion probably realized, hey, I've got to be playing like this, because he has made a lot of plays very quickly and very intently at playing the role he needs to play against Jody and not trying to play roles that don't matter. Discarding things like Expressive Iteration to your Connive to put counters on is a big tell of that.
Right, and Gabriel really getting to put on display the power of the Murktide deck here, going Ledger Shredder into Bobble, getting a Surveil off of the DRC, getting a Connive off the Ledger Shredder, and still getting a Bobble trigger. So many looks at cards and so many options. Very, very strong. It looks like Jody Verster is going to crack the clue that Thraben Inspector made and miss a land drop. That is huge for Gabriel.
Yeah, that is very important and also very terrifying, because Jody's deck is just spot removal, life gain, card draw, and Jody is not drawing cards. Probably would do something besides the clue if that was the case. We don't have lands, so Gabriel needs to be aware that there are probably a lot of answers in Jody's hand and needs to try to maneuver around them. But if Jody doesn't find a land pretty soon, that clock plus disruption is a lot easier to do when your opponent is limited on mana, which Jody's deck needs a lot of. We're not playing cheap spells.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to see Gabriel play a second Ledger Shredder, fetch shock a Steam Vents down to 17, and going to go ahead and cast a Period and getting 2 Connive triggers. and a Surveil from the DRC and the Ledger Shredders.
Agency. I have so much agency over my draw.
Just really getting to sculpt his hand and kind of get whatever he wants to set up for this unfavorable position that Jody's found himself in.
Yeah, and I like this. Once again, you see Gabriel discarding Expressive Iteration. We see a discarded Cast into the Fire. These are cards that you bring in against Jody where you think that you might traditionally want. But Gabriel knows, hey, right now, I've got to be putting my pedal to the metal, and I've got to be putting Jody on the back foot. Because if I don't, Jody will beat me in the long game, especially, if he has all spells in hand, he just needs the time to cast them. So I need to prevent that time. That is what Jody wants.
Right, and 4 triggers later, Gabriel is now resolving the Preordain. And both of the Shredders have grown. Everyone's swinging. And surely we've got Delirium. And it looks like Jody's taking it. Going down to 15. Looks like he does rip a land off the top. We see that there is a March. Looks like a couple Solitudes.
This is an interesting spot because Jody also has Martyr of Sands in hand. So there's some amount of I want to Solitude these creatures, but also I kind of want to run this Martyr out, pop it, and reveal all these white cards and just gain, 15 life and undo a lot of damage that's happened to us. And then start answering, because obviously your Solitude right now, if you're going to be casting it, it's going to be decreasing your life, which puts us in an awkward position here. But Gabriel's shields are down outside of free spells like Subtlety and Force Negation.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll see what Jody decides to go with here. Definitely a bit on the back foot in this match.
Oh. Jody's ready to grind. Abiding Grace has hit the battlefield.
Now, if you're Gabriel, what does that tell you about the position Jody's in?
Well, one, it tells me that Jody is kind of setting up for a longer game. Abiding Grace, if you haven't seen this one before, does just one of two things you're in step. Either gain a life or you bring back a 1-drop. This is saying, hey, if Jody has a card like Martyr of Sands, I am going to be kind of locked out of this game because he will continuously buy it back, reveal cards, and take over. And there it is.
Right, he is going to play the Martyr. Gabriel is tapping some mana in response. Might be a counterspell. Is going to be a counterspell. Has a Surveil trigger. Sees a Murktide. Leaves it on top. And the Martyr is going to go into the graveyard for Jody.
Interesting moment. We had the Subtlety for Gabriel, and Abiding Grace will bring that Martyr back at the end of turn. And Jody's just going to reveal all the cards in his hand and gain a lot of life. Might be a little bit of an uncharacteristic misstep there for Gabriel. Abiding Grace, like we talked about, not a card you're traditionally used to playing. It might also be willing to play around cards like Solitude, so we decided to hold up Subtlety instead. But you have to know that Jody's hand is full of spells.
Yeah, definitely an interesting spot now for Gabriel. With so much life on the horizon for Jody. And he is clearly thinking hard about how to proceed here. Looks like he's going to go ahead and cast Lightning Bolt. This will be the second spell for Gabriel this turn. So he's going to have so many triggers. It looks like we are conniving first. Bending an EI, growing a Ledger Shredder. Grabbing a second expressive iteration. This time bidding the Subtlety, growing a Ledger Shredder. Sees a Preordain on top, leaves it there. The Bolt resolves to Jody's face, taking him down to 5 life. Looks like Jody's thinking here, doing some math, making sure he's not dead on a crackback or anything.
I think Jody's won the game. I think Jody's about to gain, 12 life, reveal 4 cards, and then next turn we're going to gain 12 life, and we still have all these white spells. It's not actually over, but we're gaining a ton of life right now, and we're not doing 12 amounts of damage. So you know Gabriel's just really on the back foot, and I think that misstep on the subtlety is the thing we're going to need to come back from, and we need a card like Unlicensed Hearse right away to get that Martyr out of the graveyard.
Right, and we're going to preordain, surveil away a Brotherhood's End. Bottom 2 cards we don't need. Pick up an Unholy Heat. This is a tough position for Gabriel, who, until just last turn, was really in a dominant position here.
It really shows just how powerful some of the engines going on in Jody's deck are. Abiding Grace and Martyr of Sands is just a very, very strong engine if you are trying to play on the life total access. And just getting it through here has really, put us in an unenviable position.
Absolutely. We're going to see an expressive iteration come down for Gabriel. Of course, we're going to get connive triggers on our shredders. Now, Mason, I know you're no stranger to events like these. What is it like being a player at the feature match table, playing for your top 8 winning in at the RC? Walk us through kind of what they're feeling.
I mean, ideally, you're trying to keep that out of your mind that you're playing the winning in for the Pro Tour. You want to just be trying to play the best Magic that you can. That's all anyone can ask of you, right? At the end of the day, all that matters is we play the best that we can. And if you make, a mistake or something, you've got to hope that, you can put that out of your mind. And remember that, you have this 55-minute round to win your match of Magic, and the rest of your life to beat yourself up for that mistake. But we need to play the best we can at the 55 minutes we have.
Well, Gabriel's going to go ahead and swing out with his admittedly pretty big board, but might not matter in the face of Jody's life gain engine.
The one good thing that Gabriel has going here is, he is definitely making Jody think about evoking one of those solitudes. And if he does, it's going to stop a decent amount of damage now, but in the long term might actually end up being, less life for Jody because of the Martyr of Sands trigger we have going here. So it is definitely not, an easy decision for either player to make, but that is the one thing that Gabriel really has going, is that he has a real clock here that is forcing the Martyr to continuously occur.
Right, and we are going to see the Martyr come back, activate again, this time with 5 cards revealed, taking Jody all the way up to 21 life.
Yeah, and we see Jody reveal Wrath of God there. Gabriel has a lot of soft permission in the form of things like Spell Pierce, and has, a bunch of other cards that can cause problems.
Looks like we're going to see a March come down on the DRC. Gabriel cracking in response. I think he might still have a Spell Pierce in hand.
I think he does as well. And this will be good because it helps keep the pressure on, which we have to do. But the big problem is, I don't know if we have an answer for this Wrath of God, but you definitely just have to fight over the DRC, because if you don't fight over the DRC, then the Wrath of God isn't needed as soon. And then that means we have to commit more into the Wrath. So we're going to end up losing more if we don't fight over this anyway. So while it might feel bad, it is definitely something you kind of are somewhat priced into doing. And
now,
interesting.
Odawara into the graveyard for Gabriel off the Surveil trigger from the Spell Pierce. Looks like maybe a Stern Scolding drawn for turn. He's going to preordain, surveil away the Stern Scolding.
No, I think this was a huge draw.
Looks like a Brazen Borrower.
Yeah, I think Gabriel can now push 9 more damage, undo a little bit of the 15 we gained last turn. And then I think what we might be trying to set up is something like end of turn Brazen Borrower back the Abiding Grace, and then make you recommit the Abiding Grace while you're low on mana and hope to find an answer for it. So we're going to basically be, have another turn of maybe being trapped under this gaining a bunch of life that's happening, with the hopes that we can maybe, get there. And now
So it looks like an engineered explosives with 2 counters for Jody.
Really big. It's interesting. We talked about Gabriel setting up the maybe end of turn bouncing the Abiding Grace. We can do it now. We are going to lose, our Ledger Shredders, but we know that we don't really have an answer to stop that Engineering Explosive at the moment as we see the third Stern Scolding. I like this play a lot from Gabriel. It gives him a chance to find a counterspell for, a Grace. We know there are 2 coming, but we've got to do something like stick a huge Murktide and just shove. Jody's at 10 life. We might be able to actually fight over this and force the Solitudes to start getting evoked, which means the Martyr will be less of a problem. We can maybe get the ball going.
All right, Engineered Explosives gonna go off, deal with both of those Ledger Shredders. And we've got our borrower on an adventure.
Worth noting, Stern Scolding does counter Solitude. So if Jody goes for it, the first one at least is going to get answered by that Stern Scolding in hand.
Right, and Gabriel going to swing, deal a little more damage to Jody, and play a second DRC. We're going to go back over to Jody now. A lot of options. Looking at that Abiding Grace. Has a 1 ring in hand as well. And is going to go ahead and play the Abiding Grace. Get the Martyr back on the field. And Jody going to reveal 5 cards. Going up to 22.
Yeah, Gabriel has 9 in the air, but, the Brazen Bar, we unfortunately were not able to find the counterspell to back up, the very sick line we had of unsummoning it and then, maybe countering on the way back. But
yeah, Preordain letting Gabriel dig pretty aggressively through his deck with 2 Surveil triggers every time he casts it, but still not quite finding the cards he needs. Will swing for 9 in the air, take Jody down to 14. But 9 is a lot less than 15. Gabriel's just going to go ahead and scoop to Jody on that one. That was a wild game, Mason. I mean, really had it. And then there was that one subtlety turn with the Martyr. What do you think about how that match went or is going and how game 3 might go?
it made me a lot more confident for Gabriel to actually win the match. I thought he was a bit of a dog, but he's someone who plays a lot of Murktide, is a very skilled pilot, and I thought it was probably going to be a pretty even thing, all considered. But, after seeing that game, had we just kind of, I think, understood the power of Abiding Grace plus Martyr of Sands, an interaction we're probably not used to, we probably subtlety. And I'm going to guess Gabriel learned from that game that we need a subtlety in that spot in the future. So if we can engineer a board state like that again, we might be able to stop it. And Gabriel might understand now the things that he needs to fight over more. I talked about being very skilled, very proficient, probably going to be better than most. Still a lot of weird interactions. So we might see a little bit of sideboard changes, unsure. But I know the players are ready to get going for game number 3.
Soon we are going to see a lot of Jody's hand.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if Gabriel has a card like Tashani's Tidebinder in his deck. I'm doing a little bit of a quick search. It seems like he doesn't. That's a card that could have been weirdly awkward for Jody to have to play around, but
Absolutely. And we're going to see an apparition come down. Looks like that probably is not going to resolve. It's going to get countered by Gabriel. Now Gabriel has a Ledger Shredder and a Ragavan, and Jody is all tapped out. And he's going to get that Martyr bolted down by Gabriel.
Yeah, Jody there took a really sort of, I don't want to say greedy, but long-term approach to the game there of not popping at the end of the last turn to gain, how much ever life he would have, right? Might be a sign has not many white cards in hand from Jody, but Gabriel now gets to capitalize on this Skyclave Apparition and gets to kill the Martyr when we tapped out for it. And so now Jody's not going to be gaining as much life as, he normally would be. So this could be the spot where Gabriel can stop something like a Biting Grace from coming back down. We might be able to sort of take over this game.
Looks like there's a little bit of a judge clarification happening on this preordained trigger. Not sure what exactly happened there, but
I think we just saw the third card on accident with the preordain, and so we needed to shuffle the deck and then resume where we were with the preordain, which is why we set 2 cards aside. Those cards won't change.
And we are going to exile a temporary lockdown with this Ragavan trigger off the top of Jody's deck. Not something Gabriel's wanting to cast, but definitely happy to be exiling it from Jody. And then we're going to see a Murktide come down, and Gabriel is now all tapped out. And that's going to be a Wrath of God from Jody, cleanly dealing with the entire board.
Yeah, and Jody now knows, too, that Gabriel probably does not have a card like Counterspell in hand. Because if he did, Gabriel's been playing very patiently around cards like that in game number 1 and 2. And that's something that somebody like Jody is going to be really aware of when playing. And it's going to be like, okay, I know that maybe I can jam something like the One Ring a little bit more confidently. If Gabriel has it, probably drew it on the last turn.
Right, and we're going to see Jody play a Knight, go fetch a creature.
Knight is pretty big in the end games with this deck. With the Myriad, the Skyrim plus this, it's a good sort of lockout against decks that try to lean on non-creature spells. Also, just lets find things like Martyr of Sands. But if we want to play something like the One Ring, we might be able to sacrifice our Knight and then, successfully resolve the One Ring if we think a counterspell has been drawn later in the game. Obviously, we just talked about how Gabriel probably doesn't have one.
Right, and Gabriel just playing a land and passing for his turn. Not a great sign against a deck like Jody's that wants to take you into the late game. Of course, we do see a One Ring in Jody's hand. He's going to go ahead and blow up one of Gabriel's lands. They're both going to go fetch out a basic.
Yeah, one thing, too, that I really like about, Gabriel ended up getting Wrath of God, right? But we aren't going to win if the game gets to turn 8 or 9 against Jody. So just slamming me listen, you have one Wrath of God in your deck? Bet, let's go. It's actually factually one Wrath of God. So it's sort of a good bet there that if you don't do it, Gabriel probably has lethal or close to it on the next turn. And, now we're just sort of in a position where we need to draw a card like Expressive Iteration if we're going to get back into this in a substantial way.
Right, and a little bit hard to tell with the glare, but I think Jody played Martyr and it got Unholy Heated.
Yeah, I think it got Unholy Heated, and then Jody popped it in response, which makes sense from Gabriel, too. His Unholy Heat isn't delirious right now, so just popping the Martyr now instead of later means it won't pressure you, and it won't gain more life. So while kind of an unintuitive play, makes a lot of sense if you're trying to play towards winning, which Gabriel is, which I have a lot of appreciation for.
Right, and looks like we saw a DRC on the top, and we're shuffling it away.
Yeah, it's kind of weird where DRC, you might think any threat will do the job, but currently Jody just sits on a bunch of kill spells, and Jody attacks for 3, Gabriel has to attack for 3, and Jody has more life. So weirdly just wins the race. So looks like Gabriel's maybe trying to find an answer for this Knight Errant.
Right, and it looks like he is going to go ahead and Unholy Heat the Knight, and we are going to see the One Ring come down for Jody. No response for Gabriel. That's going to be some cards in Jody's hand. Preordained for Gabriel. It is looking tougher and tougher for him to find the cards he needs, and he's going to offer a handshake and then a fist bump and then a handshake to Jody. And Jody is going to be our winner of this match.
Yeah, incredibly well played there by Jody. I really liked how he was patient with this knight, put pressure on him, and then when we went to kill the knight, we sort of like, okay, let's pop it, clear the way, get this one ring going. The game's probably over. Incredibly well played. Clearly knows his deck really well. We're gonna have to see if he is locking up for our top 8. It looks to be really good for Jody Keith going to this last round of Switch, and we'll let y'all how that goes once we get there.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had some incredible games from players. I mean, it's getting very tight at the top. We're seeing strong decks, strong players. We're going to have a quick break, then we're going to come back to more Magic at Dreamhack Denver.